everyone. I'm David Tunick, president of the IFPDA, and I'm here to welcome you to the last Zoom of this year's print month. Today's subject is Edgar Degas prints, including monotypes, and Degas' techniques in achieving some of the greatest images, not only in printmaking, but also in the entire history of art. For me personally, I regard today's program as a kind of homecoming, since I was introduced to Degas as a 17-year-old freshman at Williams College with the Clark Art Institute, also in Williamstown, only a few steps away. I truly loved Degas from the start, and that attraction and career involvement in Degas have never diminished. I look forward in a couple of minutes to hearing Michelle Foa tell all of us about Degas as an experimental printmaker who broke the rules and expanded the conventional limits of his time in spectacular fashion. Today's presentation is a special and continuing collaboration between the IFPDA and the Print Council of America. The Print Council's Vice President, Deborah Wood, will be on in a minute to introduce Michelle Foa, but first it is my pleasure to introduce Deborah to you. Deborah earned her degree in fine arts first as an undergraduate at Cornell, and then at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She has taught printmaking and has held curatorial and other positions at several museums, including the Block at Northwestern, Baltimore, and Chicago. She has published widely, including in Print Quarterly in 2022, on something many of us have puzzled about for many years, the definition of just what constitutes an original print, a complex matter these days that our partners, the Print Council, has long grappled with. Some logistics: there will be a Q&A at the end of today's talk. Click on the Q&A button, usually at the bottom of your screen, and type in your question. If you have one, we'll address them during the Q&A session, and we'll try to get to all that are submitted, but we cannot promise that. With that, I turn the program over to Deborah Wood, Vice President of the Print Council of America.
Thank you, David. And thank you for including the Print Council of America in the IFPDA Print Month programming. The Print Council of America was founded in 1956 as a nonprofit organization fostering the creation, dissemination, and appreciation of fine prints, new and old. Since then, we have continued to grow and evolve as a professional organization with an elected membership, reflecting tremendous expansions in the fields of print curatorship, scholarship, and museum practice, and embracing the specialties of drawings, photography, and conservation. What has remained constant is our spirit of collegiality and zeal for sharing knowledge and expertise through our publications, programs, and lectures such as this one. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce to you one of our members, Michelle Foa, Associate Professor of 19th Century European at Tulane University. Her first book, Georges Seurat, The Art of Vision, was published in 2015 by Yale University Press, and her second book, Edgar Degas and the Matter of Art, is under advanced contract with Yale. Part of this research was published in the Art Bulletin and was awarded the 19th Century Studies Association Article Prize in 2022. Professor Foa co-curated the exhibition Edgar Degas, Multimedia Artist in the Age of Impressionism with Anne Leonard for the Clark Art Institute. The exhibition, which just closed October 6th, focused on Degas' remarkable experimentation and works on paper and his complicated relationship with Impressionism. Please welcome Michelle Foa.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for that introduction. And many thanks also to the IFPDA and to the Print Council for inviting me to share some of my research on Degas with you. I am delighted to have the opportunity to do so. A close family friend of Degas, seen here in his studio, offered the following astute characterization of the central place of material and technical experimentation in the artist practice. His studio was crammed with canvases, easels, jars, an artisan passionate about all the means of his art, handling turpentine, powders, composing colors, imagining procedures of reproduction that astounded the connoisseurs. This remarkable quote by a close friend of his friend writes, "In order to find one's way in the work of this half-blind alchemist, one needs all the wisdom of the specialists of his art," close quote. Along similar but far less laudatory lines, Degas' submissions to the 1879 Impressionist exhibition prompted a critic to surmise that, quote, "his brain seems to be a furnace where a new painting still in the process of being born is bubbling. He seems to be in pursuit of a poorly defined ideal whose formula he hopes to find in unexpected combinations of pastels, distemper, and oil paint. A strange collection of trials and errors," end quote. In the century since the artist's death, many aspects of his material and technical practices have been analyzed, but there is still a great deal left to uncover about the sophistication and significance of the artist's innovative modes of making, and that is especially true for his printmaking. I'd like to spend a significant portion of this lecture on an unexpected subject for a talk about Degas, namely his landscape production. The artist's attitude towards landscape painting is a topic that has long been marked by misconceptions that emerged during his lifetime and that have persisted in some form ever since, making them well overdue for correction. It is common in scholarly accounts of Impressionism for the division between the landscapists and the figural artists to be treated as an essential feature of the group, with an adversarial or competitive relationship between the two camps often implied or stated outright. Monet has been cast as the leader of the landscapists and Degas of the figural artists. One of the reasons that the latter figure has long been thought to be averse to landscape painting. This figure landscape division helped to order the large and diverse group of artists who exhibited in the Impressionist shows into intelligible subgroups, each with a clear set of priorities and practices. But it has also led to a distorted understanding of important aspects of Impressionism, among them creating the mistaken notion that Degas was antagonistic towards landscape pictures. And yet, Degas produced images of landscape throughout much of his long career, from the mid and late 1860s to the early 1890s. Many of the landscape pictures he made were prints, such as these two examples, for reasons that I believe are not at all accidental. On the contrary, the artist's preference for rendering landscapes by means of printmaking offers us important insight into his modes of working, his stance towards Impressionist landscape painting, and the pivotal role of the studio in his practice, all of which I'll address at different points in my talk. The majority of the landscapes Degas produced were monotypes, a relatively unusual printmaking process at the time that entailed manipulating a medium and an unmarked metal plate, pressing a piece of paper against it, and running the paper and ink plate through a press so that the ink is transferred from the plate to the paper. The result is a monotype print, so called because artists typically pulled only one print from each inked plate, although Degas sometimes pulled a second, much fainter impression and used it as the basis for some of his pastel drawings. During the period when he began producing monotypes, he commemorated this particular form of printmaking and the artist who introduced him to it with this painting. Ludovic Lepic, the figure seen here on the right, was an avid monotype maker, and it is from him that Degas likely first learned about the technique. The figure on the left is Marcellin Desboutins, another printmaker with whom both Degas and Lepic were close. A visibly ink-stained rag and copper plate are prominently featured near Lepic, seen more closely in the detail on the right, drawing our attention to the tools and materials involved in monotype making. Indeed, pieces of cloth were very commonly used to manipulate the ink, and the rag was a sort of symbol of the monotype artist at that time. Lepic wrote rather extensively about monotypes, and in his first published account on the subject, he referred to it as muslin printmaking, after the piece of muslin cloth he used to wipe the ink on the plates. He concluded a subsequent essay on monotypes by exhorting others to take up the technique, proclaiming, quote, "I bequeath my rag to all artists," close quote. Degas' painting gives no indication of the subjects being represented by Deboutin and Lepic, instead giving pride of place to process and materials. Degas' keen interest in the media and equipment entailed in monotype making, and here are two more monotypes from the later 1870s, was very memorably conveyed in a letter from Deboutin to a fellow artist. Written in the summer of 1876, just as Degas started producing monotypes, Deboutin characterized the artist's engagement with the process precisely as an obsession with the materials and equipment involved, declaring, quote, "Degas is no longer a friend, a man, an artist. He is a zinc or copper plate blackened with printer's ink, and plate and man are flattened together by his printing press, its mechanism having swallowed him completely. The man's crazes are out of this world," close quote. This description of Degas as so enamored with the process and equipment of monotype making that it was as if he had become physically one with them, his ink-covered body consumed by the printing press, is a particularly vivid as well as astute characterization of his sheer fascination with the matter and making of art. His landscape monotypes were primarily produced during two periods in his career. The first was in the later 1870s and early 1880s, when he made a number of them from black printer's ink, including both of these, the one on the left in the National Gallery of Art, the one on the right in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and this one in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, among many others. In work such as this picture, Degas seemed to revel in the process, acts, and gestures of mark making. So much so that the status of the work as a representation and as an arena for the artist to explore a variety of means of mark making seemed to vie in significance with one another. Pictures such as this were clearly testing grounds for the manipulation of the ink on the plate and paper with a range of instruments to produce a surprisingly diverse array of marks, despite the very modest scale of many of these monotypes, this one measuring not even 5 by 7 inches. The same is true of this work, a recent acquisition of the Met, in which the movements of Degas' tools and the gestures he employed as he manipulated them could not be more evident. The picture's left side, for example, is defined by conspicuous marks that visibly index the artist's dragging of tools through the ink to represent slashing rain, while the depicted ground in the bottom right of the picture is constituted by an array of ink marks of varying sizes and directions, all in a work that measures only 6 by 8 inches. A prolific monotypist in the later 1870s and early 1880s, Degas' production seems to have ceased by the middle of that later decade. However, in 1890, he took up the technique again, and over the next few years produced a stunning series of almost 50 landscape monotypes, using oil paint as the medium instead of ink, some of which he overlaid with pastel, as in these two examples. Before I delve more deeply into this exceptional group of pictures, I'd like to just very briefly consider what might have prompted the artist's resumption of monotype making. Less than a year before he resumed making them, Ludovic Lepic died. Not only was Lepic responsible for first drawing Degas' attention to monotypes, but the two men were close throughout the 1870s and 80s, and Degas produced several portraits of his friend during that time, including this pastel at the Cleveland Museum of Art, made in the last year of his friend's life. I want to suggest the possibility that it was Lepique's passing that spurred Degas' vigorous re-engagement with monotypes. Within a year of Lepique's death, Degas undertook what would become a remarkable, ambitious series of about 50 oil paint monotype landscapes that constituted some of the most technically and visually compelling pictures of his entire career. These early 1890s monotypes seem to have been made in relation to two trips the artist undertook during that period. The first was a journey by carriage in the fall of 1890 with a sculptor with whom he was close to visit their friend and fellow artist Charles Jonniot. Almost immediately upon their arrival, Degas set to work making a series of monotypes in Jonniot's studio. Their host wrote an account of that visit, by far the most detailed firsthand description we have of Degas' monotype making. In it, Jonniot recalls, among other things, Degas' particular attention to the qualities of the materials and equipment that were in his friend's studio, commenting, for example, on the quality of the rag provided to him by his host, which, incidentally, Jonniot later confessed to keeping as a cherished memento. The second group of late monotype landscapes was made in loose connection to a trip taken in 1892, but the details surrounding that journey are vague. Degas exhibited about 25 of these late landscapes in the fall of 1892 at Duran-Ruar's gallery, the only monographic show held of his work during his lifetime, and the last major exhibition of his career. The renowned writer Paul Valéry, who was a great admirer of Degas' work and who wrote extensively and perceptively about it, described the artist in his studio as, quote, living in messy intimacy with his tools, close quote. It is a keen observation of both the pivotal place of diverse equipment in Degas' practice and his embrace of art's wayward materiality. An attitude I think is particularly evident in many of these late monotypes. It is almost impossible to overstate the variety of marks that constitute many of these small works. The streaks, smears, and splotches of oil paint on the paper cohering just enough to register as landscapes, without their identity as paint in a variety of states at all obscured. In this work, for example, Degas likely thinned the oil paint in certain areas, thereby transforming it into a semi-liquid that could run and drip, while other parts of the picture are made with paint of a thicker consistency, capable of tracing his instrument's engagement with the medium on the surface of the support. If certain aspects of these pictures are the product of Degas' manipulation of his media with a range of tools, other parts of them are the result of actions of the paint that were not fully within the artist's control. These are pictures that were very visibly smeared, oozed, smudged, dripped, pooled, and blotted into being, the artist openly embracing the unruliness of the matter of art. One of the few critics to write a substantive review of the 1892 landscape show situated the work squarely within Degas' career-long tendency to use, alter, and combine his media in novel and often perplexing ways. Quote, "It is unusually difficult in these landscapes to discover the secrets of the recipe, the artful and exciting mix of materials for which Degas had a penchant. Everything imaginable happens here. Watercolor is treated and brushed on like oil paint, then mixed with gouache, reworked and accented with pastel, sometimes touched up and dabbed with a wad of cloth, and at other times squiggled with the tips of his fingers like a child making patterns in the mud," close quote. This critic's inability to decipher the media from which the monotypes were made reflected an important feature of the artist's career-long experimental practice, namely constantly testing and modifying his materials in highly unusual ways and exploring how they behave in combination with other media and supports, whether it be by seeing how they look and act when heavily diluted, or crushing pastels into powder and mixing it with water to produce a paste, among many other examples. In the case of his late monotypes, for instance, he often thinned the oil paint to varying degrees, sometimes transforming it into a semi-liquid that many viewers, such as the critic quoted above, mistook for watercolor. Likewise, a 1941 essay by another well-known critic described the landscape monotypes as, quote, evocations of nature in watercolor, oil, and pastel, close quote. Even Durham Ruel, in whose gallery these works were exhibited, referred to them as watercolors. The difficulty of correctly identifying the media Degas used to make these pictures was due precisely to his alchemical-like fascination with the mutability of his materials and with demonstrating their capacity for a range of behaviors and properties. In sum, all of these late monotypes represent landscape terrains, but they are also emphatically fields of marks, splotches, stains, and smears that demonstrate the process and stuff of picture making as rawly as few other works of the period do. As the pictures by Degas that I've shown thus far make clear, the artist was certainly not averse to landscape production, despite his long-standing reputation to the contrary, one that has significantly obscured our understanding of his corpus and his practice. What has long been believed to be the artist's general distaste for landscape painting was, I believe, a much more specific rejection of certain procedures of making that were widely associated with Impressionist landscapes, specifically plein air painting, or working outdoors directly in front of the motif instead of in the studio. It was a practice for which Monet was a particularly vocal advocate, and the painting on the right is one of many examples of works by him produced at least partially outdoors. According to one close friend, quote, Degas' worst jeers were reserved for landscapists who go plant their easels in front of the motif. He dreamed of a walking stick gun that would enable him to strafe all the parasols scattered through the countryside, close quote. Crucially, Impressionist plein air painting was understood by many artists and critics not simply as a means of rendering the landscape based on direct observation, but as an explicit rejection or disparagement of the studio as the traditional space of artistic production. For Degas, whose practice was defined almost entirely by his close engagement with his tools, equipment, materials, and models, and for whom the acts and processes of making that took place in the studio were central to the meaning of his work. The belittling of the studio implied in Impressionist plein air painting was likely an important source of his ire towards the practice. It is for this reason, I firmly believe, that the vast majority of landscapes he produced from the 1870s onwards were prints, precisely because they were unambiguously products of the studio, the importance of the artist's workspace for his production, demonstrated by the methods he used to bring his landscape pictures into being. This portrait of Degas and one of his models by Maurice Denis testifies not just to the essential place of models in the artist's practice, but more broadly to how fundamentally rooted Degas' art making was in the space of the studio. His total commitment to a studio-based practice, the artist seen in his studio here, has often been treated as a sign of his conservatism or his allegiance to artistic tradition. In fact, I argue that it was the opposite. The studio that contained the wide range of media, equipment, tools, and props with which he worked was essential to the kind of artistic experimentation that he consistently pursued. Along these lines, a friend of the artist recounted, quote, Degas lived in his studio between his model, his canvases, and a strange jumble of bottles, colored powders, scrapers, brushes, and mineral spirits that he used to compose his canvases, and that today leave the specialists who study them perplexed, failing to untangle the proportion of lithography, pastel, gouache, or oil mixed up together on the paper, close quote. The inventive breadth of materials, techniques, and equipment with which Degas worked absolutely required a studio-based practice. Degas' profound interest in tools and equipment is one he shared with several figures with whom he was close, including Ludovic Lepic, pictured by Degas here with his two daughters in the center around 1871. In addition to being a printmaker, Lepic was an archaeologist, participating in and sponsoring digs, and founding a museum in 1872 that exhibited some of his archaeological discoveries. That same year, he published an important book on prehistoric tools and weapons that included illustrations of replicas of old tools that he had made, such as the two that you see here. As the book details, Lepic oversaw the reconstruction of tools and weapons based on discovered archaeological fragments, making a point of only using equipment to produce the replicas that would have been available at the time the original tools were made. Once the replicas were complete, tradesmen would then test them to ensure that they were functional. Lepic was thus an early practitioner of a field that came to be known as experimental archaeology. Lepic's fixation on tools, how they were made and how they functioned, had much in common with Degas' fascination with different tools and equipment and his practice, a shared interest that might well have informed how both artists viewed their engagement with monotype. Degas' commitment to invention and unusual modes of making was also shared with several of his other close friends besides Lepic. These relationships have tended to either be largely ignored or treated as being of purely biographical interest. But I believe that they played an important part in the kind of maker and innovator Degas aimed to be. And it was in close relation to these friends' work that I think Degas saw his own artistic production. I'll focus on what I think was the most important of these relationships. The artist's extremely close friendship with Henri Ruar, seen here in a picture by Degas from around 1875. An amateur landscape painter, Ruar was an extremely accomplished, internationally renowned engineer, inventor, metallurgist, and manufacturer. His professional achievements in fields as diverse as refrigeration and ammunition are impossible to fully convey here, but I'll cite a few examples. Around 1865, he and two partners built what would become an internationally acclaimed factory of metal parts. They also started a factory and workshop in Paris, where they invented, refined, and manufactured a wide range of mechanical equipment, including, for example, gas motors, electrical generators, electrical lighting apparatus, and ice-making equipment. Ruar played an important role in the development and manufacture of the first internal combustion gas motors. He made transformative contributions to the field of refrigeration technology, and he was at the forefront of the design and production of certain kinds of electrical equipment. He also helped design Paris's pneumatic tube messes transport system and manufactured its parts. This is just a glimpse into his truly remarkable career, one defined, above all, by constant innovation and invention. The term friendship fails to fully communicate the warmth and intimacy between him and Degas, as the latter was practically a member of Ruar's family. As a close friend of Degas wrote after Ruar's death in 1912, quote, "When the door of the Ruar residence opened, one expected to see Degas. In effect, he was as much at home there as the master of the house. It is there that Degas seemed to be completely himself, up until the day that death took one of his last friends," close quote. I believe that the closeness between the two men was built in part on their shared professional commitment to invention, materials, and innovative methods of making, and that Degas was, in fact, deeply interested in his close friend's work. Along these lines, another friend of Degas remarked that, quote, "Over the course of 60 years, Degas regularly saw former students of the École Polytechnique, artillery officers, and engineers, guests of his friends the Ruar, whose company Degas repeated often he enjoyed more than some of his own colleagues. Degas' attachment to Ruar and his interest in his professional world is poignantly expressed in a touching passage from a letter that the artist wrote to his friend in 1880, in which he conveys his deep affection precisely in metallurgic and mechanical terms. Quote, "The heart is like many instruments. It must be polished and used a lot so that it gleams and runs well. As for mine, it is you who polishes it rather than its owner." Close quote. The passage not only movingly attests to the closeness between the two men, but it also reflects how much Ruar's work mattered to Degas, as well as speaks to their shared engagement with how things are made, what they're made out of, and how they operate. In articulating his closeness to his friend by comparing his own heart to, quote, "an instrument that gleams and runs well," close quote, and that is maintained by Ruar, Degas revealed in intimate terms both men's investment in the material and mechanical properties of objects, presumably including those of their own design and making. If we see Ruar's accomplishments in metallurgy, engineering, electromechanics, and manufacturing as closely related to Degas' own decades-long commitment to innovative materials and modes of production, then it is entirely fitting that the first extended study of Degas' experimental career, a book titled Degas in Search of His Technique, was written by none other than Ruar's grandson. In fact, Ruar's factory in Paris was the site of a fascinating, though little-known convergence of his work and that of Degas, in the form of the latter's experimentation in his printmaking with what were called carbon rods. These rods, examples of which you see on the left, were important components of carbon arc lamps, such as the one on the right, which became popular in the 1870s as the first widely used sources of electric light. Carbon rods were the subject of much research in the early history of electric illumination, since the quality and consistency of the light produced by lamps was significantly determined by the functioning of the carbon rods. Degas used these rods to incise the copper plates of some of his prints. And while his experimentation with this novel tool has been discussed a bit in previous sources, the significance of carbon rods to the history of electricity, the work of Ruar, and the close relationship between the two men's kinds of making and inventing has been entirely overlooked. Based on a few primary sources, we know that Degas' use of carbon rods began one evening, likely in the late fall of 1879, that he spent in the home of Henri Ruar's brother, seen here, who lived in an apartment that was part of the Ruar factory complex in Paris. Bad weather prevented Degas from returning home that evening, leading him to spend the night at his friend's apartment. The following morning, the artist wanted to make a print, and he ended up using a carbon rod found in the Ruar factory to incise a copper plate for this dry point, titled Leaving the Bath, and subsequently to produce other works as well. What I discovered in the process of researching Degas' use of carbon rods was that the connection between them, Ruar's work, and Degas' experimental printmaking extended well beyond the already significant fact that the first carbon rods Degas used came from his friend's factory. Crucially, Ruar himself had been closely involved in the design and manufacture of carbon rods. Starting in the mid-1870s, he and his partner worked with a chemist who developed what were considered to be the best performing carbon rods, and they continued to improve their design as well as to start fabricating them. In other words, at precisely the same time that Degas experimented with carbon rods as unconventional incising instruments in his printmaking practice, Ruar was directly engaged in their development and manufacture. Degas' use of this instrument thus merged his professional commitment to invention with that of his close friend, directly linking artistic innovation and forms of it in other fields. Mary Cassatt, a close friend and colleague of Degas, whom he depicted many times, including in this work of her in the Louvre, with her sister seated nearby, likewise had a particular interest in innovative printmaking. In fact, Degas' experiments with carbon rods took place just as he, Cassatt, and a few other artists were developing plans for a new publication titled Day and Night that would feature prints made by the journal's founders, as well as by other artists. In his description of Day and Night to the dealer Vollard, Degas explicitly defined the project as an arena for technical experimentation, recalling, quote, "I remember the time we started a little magazine called Day and Night together. I was very interested in processes then and had made countless experiments," close quote. Thus, it's entirely plausible that the carbon rod experiments were undertaken in connection with his work for Day and Night, and that the artist intended to reproduce the works he made using the rods in the new publication. Though the journal never materialized, the fact that Degas selected a tool used in electric illumination to produce works for a publication called Day and Night is reflective of the consistent intersections between the means and materials of making and the motifs with which he engaged that one finds across his corpus. In addition to attesting to the friendship between Cassatt and Degas and their shared engagement with various forms of printmaking, I believe this work also reflects Degas' aversion to art criticism and his firm conviction that artists understood art infinitely better than writers ever could. Cassatt, though only seen from the back, appears to be looking directly at the object on display, head cocked slightly to one side, the very image of a thoughtful, attentive viewer. Her sister Lydia, to her left, offers a pointed contrast. Seated rather than standing, her face partially hidden behind the guidebook she holds closely, she issues a distinctly tentative glance at the work around her. Timid and unsure, Lydia seems to convey Degas' belief, expressed many times elsewhere, in the futility of criticism to help one make sense of art. Late in his life, Degas sold a number of plates that he had canceled to the dealer Vollard. Few details surrounding that sale are known, but presumably Vollard purchased the plates with the intention of pulling impressions from them and had the artist's permission to do so. Among the group was the canceled plate of Cassatt in the Etruscan gallery of the Louvre seen here. The scored plate evokes both a prime period in Degas' career, when he first used it to depict his close friend and colleague, and the end of his artistic production, when he canceled and sold the plate, thus bringing to a close the career of one of the most experimental and technically innovative printmakers of his time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I knew Ruar to be the great collector, but nothing about carbon rods and the connection between Degas and Ruar from engineering and science and light. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fabulous. So we've had some questions come in. One is from Jane Risser. It says, which US venues would you recommend for viewing Degas prints? I'm particularly interested in a comprehensive collection.
His prints in particular. That's a great question. It is difficult to pick one. Happily, we are quite rich in works by Degas in the United States. Clark has a very good collection of his works on paper, including his prints. The Met, of course, has an incredible collection of his work in every medium. The Art Institute of Chicago also. The National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Have I left any out? Did I say Boston? If I haven't said Boston, also Boston. So I can't pick one, but I would say those are, you can't go wrong visiting any of those 5 institutions.
Right, and all of them have had curators and scholars who have focused on Degas, Barbara Shapiro up at Boston and John
Right.
McHenry way back at at the Met and the other institutions as well. This question is from Holly Morrison. You may have indeed answered it already in your talk, but here it is. Did Degas create drawings or photographs as references for making the landscape monotypes? The Met did have an exhibition of Degas photographs, which are mostly figurative.
Yes. Yes, to what you just said, David. I think to put it simply, no. That's not to say that photography didn't have a place in his practice, but if we're focusing specifically on the landscapes that he produced, there's no evidence that there's no surviving evidence of any photographs of landscapes produced in relation to those monotypes. Harvard, which I should add also has an incredible Degas collection, so let me add that to the list, has 2 photographs of Degas landscapes that are stunning, but not, as far as I can tell, related to any of the monotypes he produced. They look nothing like him, but they do have 2 photographs of his landscapes, which suggests that he sometimes did produce at least twice photographs of landscapes, but none that I can tell are related to the monotypes.
Okay, thank you. Carol Winters has submitted this question. What kind of press or presses were the monotypes printed on? Did artists at that time normally have presses in their own studios?
That's an excellent question. I don't have very specific information about the press that Degas had in his studio, nor about the one he used in Janio's studio to produce a good number of those late monotypes. Was it typical? My sense is no, it wasn't typical. For example, Pissarro, who was also interested in printmaking, Degas often produced Pissarro's prints for him. So I don't want to conclude from that Pissarro did not own a print, but it would seem to suggest it. So my answer generally is it's probably unlikely that many artists had those in their studio.
Given your remarkable discoveries and research, I have no doubt that next time you'll give us the details you discover about Degas' own presses.
I will try.
This is from an anonymous attendee. I don't know how we go about it. Is it possible to get a list of the pieces, titles, and sizes that are being shown today? Can they get to that through your own website?
They, from the ones in the PowerPoint that I just showed?
Yes.
No, but I would be happy to add that in the as captions and then maybe post it on the IFPDA website along with the video to the lecture. Or yeah, I'd be happy to find some way or another of getting that information to people.
That would be perfect if you send them to us at the IFPDA. We'll get them posted on the IFPDA website. Here's another question that has come in from Margaret Ellis. What was the hardness of carbon rods?
That is such a great question that I've pondered myself. Let me say, first of all, that even finding the reproductions of the carbon rods that I showed you was an enormously difficult undertaking because they're ephemeral. They were used in lamps and then they burned and disappeared. And so to find surviving examples of carbon rods from the late 19th century, reproductions of them, was difficult. I've never seen a carbon rod in person. And I have asked myself that very same question. It was clearly hard enough to incise a plate, but I think there were different types of carbon rods, let me put it that way, because as I mentioned, there was a lot of research being done at the time on them, and that may well, so there were a variety of them on the market, and one of the variables among them may have been the hardness of them, because I know some of them were coated with particular materials. So I'm not sure So I think there was a variety of carbon rods, and I imagine a variety of degrees of hardness to them.
This isn't a question, but a recommendation from Elizabeth Langer for Degas' Strange New Beauty by Jody Hauptman.
Of course. Yes.
From Phyllis McGibbon, your discussion of this is addressed to you, Michelle, your discussion of the tensions between Degas and artists who work directly on site was particularly fascinating. Did you come across any record of Degas working on monotype plates while in transit, parentheses, on a train?
No.
Easy answer. Okay.
No. There's no sketches that I've come across. As I said, there's no photographs that I've come across. Jean describes, maybe not, Degas maybe was not the most polite house guest, but he describes him arriving at his house, hello, and then going almost straight into the studio to start working. And occasionally reference the role of memory and visual observation, both in the making of them. But I haven't seen any sketches or anything of that sort to indicate that he took any kind of notes while he was traveling.
Okay, Carolyn Marie Maynard says monotypes can be hand printed with pressure from a spoon or other tool on the back of a paper. I wonder if Degas printed any of his work this way.
Not that I've ever read. I can't say for sure. I would, if I could time travel, obviously I would to that period. So, and see it all in person. Not that I've ever read. I've only read him using a press, but that's not to say he never did. It's just to say that I haven't ever come across any evidence to suggest that.
Right, here's an interesting bit of information from Claire Rogan, who says the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, has examples of carbon rods in the collection. Okay. You can go online to find them. I could send it to you when this is all over, if you like.
Thank you.
Our partner, the Print Council, Deborah Wood, has sent in some questions. And Deborah, would you like to ask them directly, or would you like me to put them to our star panelist?
Sure, I can ask them. I think one of the questions that I had, I know you've been working on Degas, studying his work for a long time, but I'm just wondering what the relationship is between the exhibition that you did for the Clark that just closed and the new book that you have coming up. Were there discoveries that you made when working on that exhibition that will be coming out in the book, or?
Thank you for that. That's a great question. These have, I should say, actually all been great questions, and thank you to all of them for asking them. I appreciate that. So the exhibition I worked on for about a year, but Degas I worked on for several years before that. So I would say that the exhibition is, and I worked, of course, with Anne on it as a co-curator, but the exhibition came out of my research on Degas.
Let me just jump in for a second. That was Anne Leonard you were referring to.
Yes, Anne Leonard, yes. So the exhibition really came, the exhibition was in a sense a dream come true, if I may, not to be too melodramatic, but because there have been very few exhibitions on Degas, as popular as he is, that really focused on his materials and techniques. The monotype show at MoMA that was stunning is an exception, but generally speaking, there haven't been that many. So I always thought it would be an interesting topic for an exhibition. And finally at the Clark, this idea that had been percolating came to life, and so that was a very exciting process. To answer your question, so I would say the research in the exhibition and the work in the exhibition came out of the work that I had been doing for years on Degas. not the other way around. But having said that, I was like thrilled, absolutely, to express some of that research and to share it in a completely different kind of way than I had been as a writer of articles and a book manuscript and so on. Thanks for
That's excellent.
That's a
Yeah.
fine way to end it. We look forward to the book. And I want to thank everybody. You guys stay on screen too, please. I want to thank everybody for attending. This is the last Zoom of IFPDA print month, but not the last event. That comes up, what, a week from Friday at the, I think it's the Print Center in New York. Look at our website for, yes, it is at the Print Center in New York. It's a special evening view. I'm reading it directly. View of the exhibition called Reprint, featuring projects published by many IFPDA members. And before we close out entirely, I want to express the deep gratitude of the IFPDA to everyone today, including Michelle Stanek, our wonderful technological whiz, but especially to our partners throughout Print Month. And that includes, I hope I'm not leaving anybody out, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the British Museum, Cleveland Museum of Art, Baltimore Museum of Art, Print Council of America, Association of Print Scholars, Print Center New York, and Print Center Philadelphia. We're immensely grateful to all of you who have contributed to our Zooms this past month. Today's was a great way to finish the month. Thank you both very much, both Rebecca and Michelle. And this is the IFPDA signing off from New York. Thank you all. Bye.
Daddy.
Thank you.
Thank you.